Now I'm going to transition seamlessly into our second discussion of an asynchronous stream, which is on mid-century rock and olds. And basically we go from the 50s, stretching it out into the early 70s with nods. So, it's a long mid-century. I'd like to introduce our panelists really briefly. Eric Weisbard, who's going to be talking about Doggie in the Window, among other things. Sean Latham and Nathan Blue together are presenting about Bob Dylan's 1966 fan mail. We have Kelso Molloy, who's going to be talking about Peter Pan versus Captain Hook in the aesthetics of Alice Cooper's I'm 18 and Neil Young's Old Man. We've got a great Annette Funicello presentation from Eric Schuman, and an apropos olds, or and youthful olds, the Dorian Gray effect, or why some recordings don't age while others do, by J.D. Considine. So I'm going to hand it over to the panelists. And for those of you who weren't here at the very beginning, what I like to do in these asynchronous discussions is to begin by asking if any of the panelists have comments or questions for each other to get the conversation started. Any questions or comments for each other to get the conversation started?
I'll start.
Okay, Kelso.
Start us off. This one, man, I've got questions for everyone, so too many questions. I'll start. Can I ask Eric? I've got a question for you. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the correlation you were making about amoral innovation and being driven by money. I'm so interested in that whole commodification, especially when the conclusions you were drawing towards the end when you were talking about commodification being like the thing that creates youth. I'm wondering, I have a lot of questions about that, and specifically wondering, in your opinion, what it is that makes youth or young people so particularly ripe for the picking, more so than other demographics that also have money and resources and interests that you'd be talking about.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I just throw words on the screen sometimes, and now I'm going to have to figure out if amoral innovation has legs. But that's a good sign. Maybe I can use it again. In a lot of ways, this goes back to when I was an undergraduate in college, and I was writing about the sort of onset of rock and roll, and I noticed that Pat Boone and Dot Records really was as much an indie label story as Elvis Presley and Sun Records. And then I started thinking, well, do we need to distinguish rock and A&D roll from rock apostrophe and apostrophe roll to sort of like distinguish the stuff that has been mythicized by Greil Marcus and a million other people into a kind of perceived wildness, and another category that's been scorned into a kind of permanent state of sheepishness. And so, that felt, and this is a long time ago, like relevant questions to ask, but I didn't have the tools to go farther. And now I think we're at a place where everything is ripe for reexamination. And it turns out there were steps along the way that I didn't know about, because honestly, this is just a way that I introduced the subject of American pop music in my lecture course, by putting Doggie in the Window against Hound Dog at the beginning of the first historical lecture. I'm trying to kind of set a tone that everything is part of this story, and that we're going to play things off of each other. But the thing that came up on social media today from a friend was the revelation that if Bob Dylan scorned Doggie in the Window, his fellow Minnesotan Prince used to actually incorporate it into his shows on the Parade Tour. So that's definitely making it into the next draft.
Yeah, Yeah, does anybody want to add anything to that? I mean, thinking especially about that amoral claim that Eric made in his presentation, but vis-a-vis the kind of rethinking of Bob Dylan that we have in the Dylan presentation in particular, the sort of seriousness with which we afford him in the kind of raucous genealogy versus his teen beat roots, right? Like the kind of teen heartthrob aspects of it that are borne out in this archive, right? This kind of satchel, literally a moldy satchel of letters from 1966. Do you all have anything to maybe add to thinking about that, like the kind of youth reception of Dylan and where it falls along those lines of, the kind of commercial and the kind of prototypically commercial versus what we kind of romanticize now?
Yeah, I mean, I think and I want Nathan to be able to talk about the letters, but I think the thing that's pretty interesting in relationship to this is as you said, the sort of narrative the received narrative of Dylan is that he comes out of the folk world and sort of makes this transition to rock and shocks everyone. And it's as if the pop world or whatever it was didn't exist. And there was never any thought that Dylan was going to somehow drift down into something like commodification. But these very first articles, I mean, all the early criticism about Dylan is appearing in the pages of these teen magazines alongside like, what should I wear to my prom? Right. Here's how you write to these other stars. So, I mean, I don't think Dylan necessarily had I haven't seen any evidence that Dylan had any direct hand in doing that. Rather, he was just kind of fed into the CBS machine. He was this young kid and they just kind of fed him into the publicity machine. This is what they knew how to do, was to write up these sort of these little puff pieces and send them off to teen magazines, and they would just kind of fold them into their little gossip column. Sometimes it was just one or two little lines in a magazine, and fold them into these kind of weird, we've got their addresses, if you send us 75 cents we'll send you 100 addresses of your favorite pop stars, which is surprisingly, when we opened this fan mail bag, or when Nathan opened the fan mail bag, all these letters start referencing, I got your address from Teen Beat, I got your address from here and there. And to see, I think not only in that magazine context, but as some of the slides Nathan put up showed, to show just how overwhelmingly Dylan's at least fan mail writing base was women rather than men, right? I mean, Nathan, the number's almost 75% or something like that, right?
Yeah, I think right now it's about 2/3 are women or female.
Which again goes against the kind of Dylan as this kind of, model for how to rethink a poetic masculinity in relationship to folk and rock. And I think that's one of the most interesting things that we've discovered so far. It doesn't necessarily mean I think that that's Dylan's actual fan base, but it does mean that's where people were reading about Dylan, and was in teen magazines directed at girls, and girls were writing. I mean, clearly the readers of 17, are 13, right? I mean, you always read the magazine that's meant for somebody older than your demographic. And with titles like 17 and Ingenue, these are clearly girls who want to be sophisticated and be able to talk a little bit about that. And there's Dylan. I mean, the other weird thing that is right around the time that Dylan's first piece appears in 17 is Pete Seeger is writing an advice column in 17 as well, which is kind of a weird fact when we look back at it.
And Eric popped a question into the window. I'm going to hold on to that for a minute so that we can bring some of the folks. I actually wanted to bring in maybe some of the 70s oriented papers into the conversation a little bit. Also to invite Neil if he wants to add something, related to this question into the mix. And that is, in Eric's presentation, the kind of the recuperative gesture towards Patti Page was about, her use of multi-track recording, overdubbing technologies. And that's a big part of JD's presentation, really is about how certain things endure based on technological innovation, right? And particularly like in what kind of lasts as, in that framework. So I kind of wanted to think about the role that these technologies play in codifying or solidifying an idea of youth that's attached to pop in particular, to pop music. And then to kind of bring Kelso into the mix around that is to think about how the persona you're talking about, and especially the Alice Cooper, the ageless Alice Cooper persona is in and of itself a kind of technology of youth that's being used in this particular way. And obviously Annette kind of loops into that in different ways as well, around, like her marketing, her persona is also a kind of technology around building that out. So I'll just throw that out there to start the conversation, bring in a few more folks.
I mean, what you were saying about, I hope you can hear me, what you're saying about technology, one of the things that's sort of central to my paper is that basically recording technology plateaued in the late 60s. You can talk about delivery systems as having changed or improved, so you no longer have surface noise with CDs, or you can have your entire library on your phone, but the sound quality is basically stayed the same. And that's one of the reasons why records that were made in the late 60s, early 70s still sound like modern records, because there was a difference. You go even like 1962, most recordings made in 1962 sound older than recordings made in 1969. One of the things that wound up on the cutting room floor, because I tried to keep everything in the 15-minute window, was I had initially wanted to talk about the soundtrack to Guardians of the Galaxy, because in there you've got a really good conceit about timeliness and timelessness, because there's this mixtape that the main guy, whose name I have to look up, Peter Quill, that he got from his mom, and it's the only thing he has to hold on to his memory of his mom, and it's all songs from the late 60s and early 70s. And I think, if I remember the film correctly, practically the first thing you hear in the movie is Blue Swede's Hooked on a Feeling, with that ooga chaka chant. And what's absolutely brilliant about that is that you listen to it and you think, God, this is corny, which was exactly the way you listened to it in 1974 when it was new. It was corniness as a hook. And by sort of exploiting that, what the film does is it connects you both to the present when you're hearing it, where it's a song pretty much everyone in the theater knows, and the sense of the past, which is what it's supposed to represent in the movie. And then there's a sort of ongoing joke in the film about how great those songs are. All these aliens who've never heard them before think they're wonderful new sounds. And I think that really kind of sums up the way that these constants that have been carried through in popular music, so that the language and sound continues to be the same, makes these recordings seem timeless, makes them seem young, even when we know that they're not. And I think that's, it's not really making them youth. It's not because it's not about nostalgia. It's about function. They still work the same way. And one of the things that also wound up on the cutting room floor was in my video was I wanted to talk about swing music. People tend to think of swing music as being not unrelated to rock and roll. And that's very wrong, because swing music is all built around the first and third beat. And if you listen to, for example, In the Mood by the Glenn Miller Orchestra, it sounds like it implies a backbeat, because the melody throws across it's syncopated across the beats until you get ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But the driving rhythm is a hi-hat, and the hi-hat is playing 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's really ancient. Nobody plays music like that anymore. And that's a big difference between music of somebody else's youth and music that's still useful today.
Actually, can I build on that? Something it's kind of perfect to ask something I was going to ask about your presentation. Anyways, one thing I love about Guardians of the Galaxy is, and the mixing of that, all their music mixing, is the way they go in and out of like diegetic and non-diegetic sound. And so it's supposed to be on a tape player, and it's that whole thing that like kind of a retro Walkman vibe, even though that they remastered and mixed those songs on a multi-million-dollar soundstage. But the way that they kind of do the reverse Dorian Gray, the reverse of what you were talking about, where you would have a really crisp recording and then go back and try to age it, and like why you would want to do that and sort of playing on whether or not you've ever thought about expanding yours and flipping it around and talking about what it means for songs to like not be able to age or to want to be aged.
Well, there is this sort of audio effect that they sometimes use on recordings where they try to make something that they cut in the studio sound like it was on a 78. And what they do is they compress the hell out of it. They take off all the high end and the low end, and they add static to make it sound like surface noise. And I mean, you can do that as a special effect. And I'm trying to think, I have somewhere in the back of my mind, I can remember a pop group that actually did that on purpose, but I can't remember who it was. But it was a sort of thing that was an effect to make it sound like a time machine thing with the song, and then they went into their contemporary sound, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, that is something that you can sort of reverse engineer. But I mean, it also helps if you do it in a musical style that sounds old. I mean, it's like, to take another film example, The Sting. Part of what made The Sting redolent of that era was that they used ragtime music rather. It was recorded contemporarily, and it became actually a novelty hit for Marvin Hamlish. Yeah, but I mean, the thing is that those were the rhythms of that age. So it was bum ba dum ba dum ba dum ba bum ba bum. It wasn't swung at all. It was hard, dotted eighths and sixteenths, and it sounded from a different era because of that. Even though the sound quality was modern, the feel was not.
So I want to bring some of the conversation that's happening in the chat into the kind of vocal conversation in the room. And that is around, how it is about the kind of aging or aged vocalities of some of the performers that we're talking about here, whether or not it's Patti Page and Annette Funicello sounding older, right? Or being thought of as older, even in certain cases being marketed as older. To, as Sean noted about Dylan, the disconnect between the rasp and his baby face, right? And again, we have the kind of perpetually young Alice Cooper who can stay 28 forever, right? And the different ways in that either is represented or not represented sonically in the arc of his career. I just thought I'd throw some of those bits of the conversation in the chat conversation into the live conversation. So I don't know if Neil, you want to comment on it, or Sean or Eric?
I think it's really interesting that both Patti Page and Annette really this vocal with tracking there, she was herself, like Harry Nilsson would do much later, to kind of create a chorus of her own voice to serve as backup, very, very closely double tracking her vocals, because as she admitted, she did not have the best vocal range. So really doubling her vocal track as Camerata did was less to, it may have served to age her vocals up a little bit. She had a much deeper than teenagers might. And I think that the end result was, it creates this very weird disconnect between she's one of people on the top television, but isn't necessarily being marketed towards a young audience with her music. And it very much smacks of like, we're not entirely sure who this is for, but if it's for everyone, then great. That's more record sales for us.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I would sort of throw into the mix here in some ways derives from a Keir Keightley article of some years ago about how the first scare in the music industry wasn't really around rock and roll in the post-war era. It was around singles that used multi-tracking, that used studio editing to come off as essentially mass cultural confections. And so for someone like Frank Sinatra being urged to go this route by Mitch Miller, this was an atrocity. This was a violation of the rules of good musicianship. And so I think some of that is lingering throughout a lot of the stuff that we're talking about now, that these are early years in using the studio as a place to manipulate sound, to play with identity. And the best thing I've ever read about this is really Alban Zach's work on music of the 1950s, where he really treats the recording studio as an essential part of the music and really reviews how much the sort of epistemology of music was under assault at this moment. And I think age turned out to be part of that, because young people often become fluent in new things before anyone else. And so it's not that everyone wasn't affected by it, it's that some people achieved fluency and that gave them a certain authority. But it's an authority over an epistemologically very unclear realm. And we've been living with that confusion ever since.
One thing that struck me about the other Patty Page recording you had on your talk, Eric, was Tennessee Waltz, was how ungodly slow it was. Because I've played that tune, and I'm used to it being at a da 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 da, and she was like half that tempo. It was just astonishing.
Yeah, it was the after the ball of the country music era.
Maybe it's
Certainly doesn't have, it doesn't have the pep of the Spike Jones version.
Go ahead, Kelso.
I was going to say, sorry, I'm slow at reading and listening and talking all at once. To your point from the comments, I think it's something that's so cool and interesting about what you said is that kind of irony that fits in so perfectly with rock music, that if you are somebody who wants to be older, that's a quality that people often associate with being really young. Like, oh, you're young and you want to be older. But if you want to be young, then that's like a sign that you're old. It's like, it's one of those things, like you can't, as soon as you want one thing, that it, automatically disqualifies you from that. It's immature to want to be older, but it's kind of out of touch to be desperate to be young. And I think that just, man, if that doesn't scream rock, I don't know what does.
I was going to say, it might be time to bring back in Eric's question about the off-the-record details on Dylan's letters while we have you here, because there is a lot of, I know that you can't give us direct quotations or anything like that, and you gave us the kind of the data analysis, but do you all have anything to offer about that, Sean, Nathan?
I mean, Nathan's the expert on the letters. I mean, I kind of had a question for him about, I wonder how often now people refer to Dylan's age or are asking about it, because Dylan lied consistently, at least through 66 about how old he was, how he'd come to become a star. And that voice was part of the lie, right? The way that he would cover a lot of those folk songs was to make him sound like this kind of Woody Guthrie vagabond from a previous era. We're not exactly off the record here, so I can't give actual off the record. I know we're being watched. But that said, I mean, Nathan, we can talk in really general terms about the letters we just can't put individual names to things because the authors of those letters own the copyrights to them. But Nathan, do you have some thoughts? I mean, I would what are some of the things that I know you've talked to me about this. Tell me about tell us about some of the stories that emerged from the letters, especially the one character that you ended up following.
Yeah. By character, do you mean, yes, okay.
Yeah, coming to you live from Desolation Row or whatever.
Yeah. So there was one letter that said something like that. It was like Desolation Row, USA, nowhere USA or something, which I thought was awesome. That was a return address or something like that. Not exactly sure where that was on the letter, but I thought that was great. As far as age goes, I haven't noticed any significant trend with seeing comments about fans inquiring into his age. If anything, it's been more about them kind of telling about their age. Comments kind of like, us teenagers agree with you in that sentiment, which is interesting, and that kind of ties into the commodification with Doggie in the window too. It's they can kind of be seen in that light. Yeah, age is mostly from the perspective of the fans. I feel like, in the letters that I've gotten to look at.
How about just other thoughts about the tone of the letters and what kind of things stand out?
Yeah, definitely a lot of praise. Definitely a lot of, I wouldn't normally write a fan letter, but I'm going to write one to you. That kind of tone. A lot of comments on their favorite album, or a lot of times, I think I mentioned this a little bit in the presentation, but a lot of times they'll mention how many albums and singles they have. I have this record and this one and this one. They'll kind of like list them off, which I think is interesting. It seems like that, plus the comments about, I wouldn't normally write a fan letter, but I'm going to write one to you, kind of give this tone of like justifying their fandom in a way, which is interesting. Maybe some of that tone of like the serious musician kind of comes around 66, of course, with the switch to rock and everything. But albums, definitely a few pictures which are interesting. A few other objects are in there. As far as more general tone, yeah, the biggest tone I get is praise. I mean,
one,
go ahead.
One thing Nathan's described to me that really stood out is the interactivity of the fans with Dylan, that they were sending him lyrics like, what do you think of this song I wrote? Maybe you want to perform this on stage at some point. I mean, there was an affective relationship there. I mean, I don't know enough about other fan cultures to know, was it a thing to sort of send your lyrics to your favorite musician and say, will you perform these for me? Or will you work with me as a songwriter? But clearly Dylan had a significant group of people that wanted to write to him, wanted to give him their poems, their lyrics, their songs, and say, can you perform this? Or what do you think of this? That's a very different kind of fan culture than just sort of saying, I like your album. Dylan was seen as a sort of almost like, I don't know, inspiration or co-creator, or, you know, that because he'd sort of moved this poetic individual voice into rock, that everybody felt there was a space for their voice there to be heard, right? That anybody can now do this. If you can write compelling lyrics, I can just send them off and Dylan will express me right on stage somehow. I find that very strange.
Yeah, the inspiration aspect there is definitely in the letters. I've read a few that will mention how they actually inspired him to write in general, like start writing poetry or verse or something like that for songs, start learning to play guitar, stuff like that, inspiration there. That's pretty evergreen in the letters.
So we officially are out of time, but because we went a little over with the last panel and because there's a break after the next one, I'm going to give us a couple of extra minutes here to wrap up any closing thoughts from the panelists or comments that you all wanted to make, or to make room for a last question if anyone has one. I know that there were some comments in the chat as well.
Maybe one back to Kelso to just talk a little bit more about that early 70s moment as the capper on this era of so much youth in question.
With the capper, oh, that's big promises there. What did I say is the capper? Yeah, I think, well, the capper for me, for the sort of early 70s picture, but kind of going to Karen's earlier question about having a persona as a technology, and how the early 70s, and even talking about going back to other Erics, whole presentation about the impressiveness of concept albums and how that flourished in the 70s. I think what was amazing to me, thinking about youth and thinking about, you have this technology, this, if your persona in rock is a technology by which you could be any age you pick, because Alice Cooper now is in his 70s, so realistically it doesn't really matter if he picks 50, if he picks 18, if he what age. Even when people want to be this eternal youth, it's not. And I think we can kind of see this with talking about Disney, talking about sort of like children's songs like Doggie and whatever. Nobody wants to be that young. Nobody wants to really be a youth, like a kid. Even Alice, who's singing I'm 18, even his persona is 28 in his mind, which I was, in my interview with him, I was so interested in, because I figured he would say that, yeah, he's 18. The whole point is I'm 18, and that's a great age. And that even that character who has sort of metaphysical, properties still wants to be an adult, and what I would consider an adult, but in the rock world, as long as you're under 30, you're not. So that's where I would leave that.
Well, the other thing about music from that era, late 60s, early 70s, is where an awful lot of the music began to be filmic, if you will. There was the notion of there being more than just a song. There was a persona, there was a narrative. And
stage show.
Exactly. And without
gotta have at least 3 guillotines.
And that's the whole thing with Alice Cooper. It was well before 18. His image was one of spectacle, of playing a character, of not being self-expressive in the classic 60s, I'm being who I am with my music and my guitar sense of presentation. It was, this is an act, and we're going to tell you stories, which is very, I mean, it's probably not accidental that also this is when the first wave of rock movies started coming out, and you had things like that, the film of what's his face, Kurt Russell's film of film of Tommy, which tried to be as visually excessive as the music was sonically excessive, and you had the unforgettably bad Sgt. Pepper's movie, and you had, I believe Pink Floyd were actually running bits of film behind their performances. So I mean, that was a kind of a different thing. And if you think about the way film deals with youth, it ignores it. The characters are never too young or too old. They're always this sort of age where it's like Tom Cruise. I don't know how old he is really, but he basically hasn't changed his appearance in 40 years.
I think there's some kind of I was going to say I think that there's some wonderful irony about the fact that Annette was somebody who had the backing of a major motion picture studio behind her and was really an actress first, and a singer kind of on the side. She didn't last as a recording artist long enough to get into that era where albums could have taken on, the closest that she had to a filmic type album were the ones that were tie-ins to movies that she was in. But to that last point about like age agnostic performances in movies, Annette is in the early 60s Babes in Toyland, where she is pursued romantically for comic purposes, but is pursued romantically by Ray Bolger, who is probably old enough to be her father. And it is just, it's played, he's the villain, it's played as supposed to be creepy and over the top, and other characters do regard it as weird, but it's not so uncommon in movies of that time, especially musicals of that time. And so, yeah, I just think that's another very overarching thing of, how old is somebody? How old is somebody supposed to be? How old is somebody claiming to be? And the kind of discordance between all of those.
Thank you all. And on that note, we're going to have to wrap up there. How old is anyone really supposed to be? Thank you to the Mid-Century Rock and Olds. All of the presentations are still going to be archived on the Mopop page. So if you didn't get a chance to see all of them, please do check them out. They're really great.